Morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Beasley Allen webinar, Rear Crashworthiness, Wasted Space and Wasted Lives. My name's David Byrne, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this important litigation topic. Today, Chris Glover, the managing partner for Beasley Allen's Atlanta office, is going to talk with us about the complex task of investigating and preparing a crashworthiness case. Chris will explain the science behind rear crashworthiness, and he'll discuss the manufacturer's duty to protect occupants from injury or death during a rear-end crash. So, while we're waiting on the last of our registrants to join us, let me take just a few moments to formally introduce to you my friend and partner, Chris Glover. So, Chris is a longtime leader in Beasley Allen's personal injury and product liability section, and he currently serves as the managing attorney of our Atlanta, Georgia office. Since joining Beasley Allen in 2008, Chris has dedicated 100% of his time to protecting the rights of survivors of catastrophic personal injury, victims of wrongful death. To date, Chris's clients have received verdicts and settlements totaling over $300 million. And he's done that in everything from defective product cases, car accidents, commercial truck accidents, workplace accidents, and aviation accidents. Now, apart from his duties with Beasley Allen, Chris has also been a major leader in some of our most important professional associations. Among other things, Chris has served as the chairman of the American Association for Justice's New Lawyers Division and the Emerging Leaders Division. He's also served as president of the Southern Trial Lawyers Association. And finally, Chris currently serves on the Georgia Trial Lawyers Association Executive Committee, and he's a past chairman of the Georgia Trial Lawyers Association Education Committee. So, needless to say, Chris has been a huge asset, not only to Beasley Allen, but to the entire Georgia Bar Association, and we're really happy to have him with us today. Now, before I turn the program over to Chris, I need to go over just a few housekeeping notes. First, today's webinar has been approved by the Alabama and Georgia State Bars for 1 hour of CLE credit. In order to get that full credit, you've got to stay on for the duration of today's program. A link to today's presentation was included in the Zoom confirmation email you should have received when you registered. But by the end of this week, you'll receive another email with a certificate of attendance and an updated presentation and video link. You can email your completed evaluation form to webinars@beasleyallen.com. This webinar is being recorded. And for those Alabama and Georgia attorneys participating by phone, please email us your name, your phone number, and your state bar ID number. You send that now to webinars@beasleyallen.com. That's webinars@beasleyallen.com. That'll help us ensure you receive full CLE credit. Also, be sure to check out the events page of our website. That's at beasleyallen.com/events. As we're going to be adding more webinars throughout the year. Finally, if you have questions during today's webinar, I want to encourage you to use the question and answer feature located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We're going to set aside time at the end of today's program to try and tackle all of the questions submitted by our viewers, so please send us those questions. We'd love to try and answer all of them for you. So, with all of that being said, Chris, let's go ahead and get started.
Thank you, David. That was very kind. And I just wanted to thank you all for joining us. Good morning, webinar world. I am honored to be here speaking to you all about a topic that is truly important to me. I have been passionate about products liability cases my entire career. I worked on them since the very beginning. In fact, my very first deposition was in Dearborn, Michigan. The deponent had a blue oval behind the back of the chair he was sitting in, and that's where I got started. It was an intimidating place to take your first deposition. I believe in my first few years of practicing law, now over 20 years ago, I spent more time in junkyards than I did courtrooms. And that was because I was passionate about learning the engineering behind what I do, and that's automotive product liability cases. I wanted to know how seatbelts worked and how airbags worked and what made a tire fail and where you should put a fuel system in a vehicle to protect it from impacts. And so I spent lots of time with engineers and with expert witnesses, asking them lots and lots of questions to better learn the science and the engineering behind what I do to help my clients. And so a little bit of what my goal today is to just share with you some of that knowledge, some of what I've learned over the years as it relates to rear crashworthiness. Like a lot of cases that you have, you get passionate about them because that's the case that you get. I didn't get passionate about rear crashworthiness, absent of being involved in a case that taught me about it. I can tell you that I could build a pretty good airbag. I think I've handled so many airbag cases. I could build a pretty good seatbelt system because I've handled airbag and seatbelt cases. Likewise, I could build the pretty good back end of a structure of a vehicle. I've had rear crashworthiness cases, a number of them. I probably couldn't build a good exhaust system. Never had a case. So the knowledge that I'm sharing with you today was gained working a number of cases over a long period of time. In fact, the first case that I'll talk to you about later this morning was over a decade ago and involved vehicles that aren't even made anymore. So I've learned all this information over a period of many years. And so let's kind of get into it a little bit. I'm going to switch now to the presentation itself, and I'll share my screen with you so you all could follow along with me. And so let's see. There we go. So we're talking about rear crashworthiness. And so what is rear crashworthiness? Well, crashworthiness is simply the ability to protect an occupant or the responsibility to protect an occupant in a collision. Crashworthiness has a number of principles that apply to it. There's the initial role that the car has to protect the occupant. And then if the car does its job, then you have safety systems within the car that's job it is to protect the occupants, like seat belts and airbags. So what you're assuming is the car has not caused you to get hurt in the initial impact. It either was soft enough, and I'll talk a little bit about this, to not cause accelerations on your body, or hard enough to not collapse on you. And then once that happens, then your seatbelt needs to keep you from having what's called the second collision, the collision with the steering wheel or the dashboard, and the airbag and the seatbelts are designed to help you with that. And there's other systems in the vehicle. Interior car parts are made very soft, surprisingly, so that if you hit them, you don't get hurt by hitting them, or you're not supposed to. And so the issue here today, though, is going to back up to the very beginning issue that I talked to you about. The car itself should protect you from impact. And so a guy named Hugh DeHaven is largely known as the father of crashworthiness. He was one of the first biomechanics who looked at the issue of crashworthiness as it related to automobiles. His work goes back to the 1950s, and he recognized many of the principles that, frankly, car manufacturers are still working on implementing today. What we've seen is that car manufacturers can be slow to implement technology. They do so most often when forced to do so by the federal government or by exterior marketing forces like the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety. When they would institute a new test, and the car manufacturers would design the vehicle to meet that test. And that's one of the problems we'll talk about today, is there aren't a lot of standards out there that relate to rear impacts. And so even though Mr. DeHaven recognized that cars should be made to withstand rear impacts many years ago, some cars still do not. Now, the first principle that he has, it says that, and I've highlighted the red portion that really matters to what we're talking about today, and that is that a car should be designed so that it does not collapse under reasonable or expected forces. And that really kind of gets down to the fight of these cases. That is the dispute. We would say that the reasonable forces are X. The car manufacturers are going to say that the reasonable forces are much lower at Y. And the jury is going to decide, should the car protect an occupant in the collision that the case is about? Was it too severe, or was it reasonable? And I readily admit, look, if I get hit by an 18-wheeler from behind at heavy speeds, if I get hit by a train, there's no car in the world that can protect me. There's no reasonable design that should be made to protect you in those situations. If to do so, you would so really change the fundamental design of cars, and you would to protect you in those, you basically be driving around in a tank, and you wouldn't want that. So the issue is, can you reasonably design a vehicle and to do the job that it was designed to do, to get you around, take you to the grocery store, get your kids back and forth to ball practice and cheer practice and all that you do in life, and still accomplish its goal of protecting you. And so we'll talk a little bit about why in litigation it's important to demonstrate that. The second principle Mr. DeHaven had is very, very similar, and that the car can't be made of brittle, frail materials that collapse. They must resist the force and absorb energy. And I want to talk a little bit about that in just a second. Those are two different things: resisting force and absorbing energy, and to protect the inner container. And the inner container is the occupants. So here's a kind of a really rough depiction of a car. These are vehicle protection zones. You've got a crumple zone in the front and a crumple zone in the rear. And then you've got what's called the safety cage. And that is where the occupants go. That's the survival space. That's where your occupants are located. And as such, it needs to maintain its space. It's kind of obvious. So, but there's competing forces. So the way it's been explained to me, and the way I like to talk about it, is if you have a crash and it's from the front or the rear, what you want initially is a soft car. Well, why would you want a soft car in your impact? You want a soft car in your impact because if it is if it's so hard, if it's uncrushable, then the speed at which you're hit, your car is going to be accelerated to that same speed. The accelerations that you experience in that crash are going to be the same accelerations of the crash. Why? Because the back end or the front end of your car didn't absorb any energy. So you want a softer car. Imagine hitting a marshmallow. If you were to hit a marshmallow, that marshmallow is so soft, it's going to absorb energy, and it's going to protect. It's a cushion, and it protects what's on the other side of it. Here's the problem with the marshmallow. In certain crashes, the marshmallow will continue to crush. The marshmallow will continue to crush all the way through the marshmallow. Well, now you've got another problem. You've got a survival space that has to be maintained. It can't be crushed. The survival space has to be maintained in the crash, because if it crushes, then the people inside the car lose the space they have to live. It reminds me of the submarine that we have all watched in anticipation this year that crushed on the people. That's what happened to them. They lost their survival space when the submarine crushed on them. That can happen in a car crash. And so engineers, when they're designing cars, have the task of making it soft enough in the beginning phases so that you don't get these high accelerations, but the car needs to get progressively harder as you get closer and closer to the occupant space. And then once you get to that occupant space, you've got to stop. You have to stop the crash. The safety cage has to be strong enough at that point to stop it. And what a lot of manufacturers do is they put, as you get closer and closer to the safety cage, they use different methods like high strength steel, foam filling. They use reinforcements where they double up steel, and they make the occupant zone the safety survival zone harder and harder so that the crash stops when you get to the occupants. This was the first case I worked on. It was back in the car was a 2001. I think I worked this case in the early 2000s. And this is when I really began to learn about rear crashworthiness. This was a 2001 Chevrolet Cavalier. I get the case and I instantly look at it and I think this is not a case. The crash is too severe because, as I told you earlier, if you get hit by an 18-wheeler or if you get hit in a crash going 70, 80 miles an hour, there's no reasonable car design. The best car in the world is not going to protect you. Volvo hadn't made a car that can do it. Mercedes hadn't made a car that can do it. And so you really have to have a car that it is a reasonable impact. And so I'll look at this picture that you're all looking at now, and I think this was an unreasonable impact. Why? Look how severe the crush is. And so I think this is probably not a case. In this case, I represented the front seat passenger who had died in the crash. She had been crushed by the collapsing vehicle, even though she was seated in the front seat. This is another picture. You can see that the structure of the vehicle was crushed forward towards her passenger front seat position. Another side picture, just another crush view. But this is when I first began to scratch my head a little bit and ask myself, what's going on here? Why did the Cavalier look so badly damaged? And this is a small Nissan 240 SX. This is a little bitty sports car. And it's got very little damage. I mean, we're talking less than a foot of crush at the bumper level. And the structures above the bumper really are the crumple zone we talked about earlier, that kind of marshmallow zone where you would expect to see some crush because it's softer. And so this is not a lot of damage. And what you can tell if you look at the whole 240 here is that the occupant compartment zone is completely intact. So these two cars were in the exact same crash. They experienced the exact same forces. We have, those of us who have taken physics understand the equal and opposite forces principle. And so what we have here is a situation where two cars are in the same crash, but yet have two very different outcomes. And so I began to ask myself, why? Why is this? Is the front of a car really the fear that safer? Well, the answer began to be clear, yes. And I wanted to know why. I thought initially, well, it's because there's an engine up front. That's got to be the reason. Actually, it's really not. The real reason, as you'll see, is that cars are tested to a much higher standard for frontal impacts. The federal government has many frontal impacts that it requires cars to go through. The Insurance Institute for Highway Safety has even more severe impacts, and they'll put out ratings for frontal impact for the public to shop and say, this car has a 4-star rating or a 5-star rating. If your car doesn't do good in those tests, in the federal government test or the IIH test for frontal impacts, then guess what? You're on Dateline, you're on 60 Minutes, and you all have watched those videos where you've got the crash dummy getting crushed in on cars. And then guess what? Now the car company has a crisis because they now have to deal with the marketing problem of their car not being safe. Nobody wants to put their children or families in unsafe vehicles. And so they really do sometimes create cars that are test created for the test, and there are lots of tests. And so they put load pass in the front of vehicles and lower load pass, upper load pass that are designed to absorb that energy and do like what we talked about earlier, which is to be soft and get progressively harder. And this is a great, look at this picture. It demonstrates that principle perfectly. How the car got progressively harder and stopped prior to entering into the occupant compartment. And so those are principles I began to learn about there. We did some force deflection curves. We found some testing on the Cavalier, rear impact testing, and that gave us a lot of insight into what was going on in this car. Now, as we know that DeHaven talked about, the principle is that the car should be getting stronger and stronger and stronger as you get closer to the occupant compartment. Look what this car does. What you can see is at the initial phases, and this is a time and force graph. You can see that the bottom graph is time, the side graph is your force. And so look, the forces are really high early in the crash. And then the trunk. Well, what happens in the trunk? The forces drop to almost nothing. It's not absorbing any energy. It's basically a tin can, sheet metal, not much different than a Coke. It's a little thicker than a Coke can, a lot of these cars in this area. And so they crush all the way through the trunk. So you've got all this wasted space where the car's not getting harder and harder. And then you enter into the occupant compartment. You can see the graph where you get to the rear seat, and it peaks a little bit, but really it doesn't even peak as high as it did at the initial phases. This car is not getting harder and harder and harder. And then it drops off again. You go through the back seat all the way to the front seat, and the car is not getting stronger. That's why you've got such different results between the Nissan 240 and the Cavalier in that crash. Here we got, we've taken the same Cavalier vehicle, and we've compared the frontal crash test. We had lots of publicly available data on frontal crash tests on the Cavalier. We were able to look at the force deflection curves and see, what does the front do? Well, as it's designed to do, it gets stronger and stronger and stronger as you get closer and closer to the occupant compartment. Why? They have to. They're forced to create. The testing requires it in the front, but the back, you can see the blue is the back data. The red is the front data, and you can see that it doesn't in the back. And so kind of built a case around that. And that was what the case was, is that the back of the car, that rear end collisions are just as foreseeable as front end collisions. Matter of fact, I've got less control over if I'm hit from behind than if I'm hit in the front. If somebody hits me from behind, I've got very little control over that. And so I want my car to be safe when I have no responsibility for whether I was hit. And so that's one of the things that we looked at. We also learned in this case about door protection. So there's a load pass throughout a car. Doors have door beams in them that are very strong. Many times they're made of high strength steel. And those door beams really do a good job of creating a load path all the way to the front of the structure. So what you want to do is to tie the back of the structure all the way to the front of the structure. And so you can see here that the doors all popped open in the crash. The door latches didn't maintain their integrity. The doors lost their strength to resist and you had no load path from the front to the back. And that allowed the front to crush all the way to the front seat. This is a good view of the front seat. You can see there the passenger front seat, how it was crushed forward, and can understand why this young lady lost her life. And that was the first case I worked on. Another case that I've recently worked on involved this young man. He was 5 years old, and he lost his life in a rear impact collision. He was an amazing young man, and just had the privilege of representing him. It was a tough case for me because I got really tied up in his life and his family's life, and we finished this litigation not long ago. But this is a little bit of information about how the crash occurred. My client and his son were parked at this stop sign. Or red light. They were waiting on the light to turn. He could see his home from where they were at. They were coming home from school. The son had a really good day at school that day. Dad picks him up, carries him home. They're almost home when they get hit from behind in a rear impact collision by this car, this lady driving the car behind them. The impact from behind causes this damage. Now, I've already had the Cavalier case from years before. And so now my interest is peaked initially, or quicker, I guess, than it was before. And I'm comparing this damage and I'm thinking, here we go again. We've got disproportionate damage between the front of one vehicle and the rear of the other. And so I began the investigation of asking myself, why is that the case? You've got an SUV on the left that has very little crush, and you've got the sedan on the right that's got severe crush. The crush to the sedan was so severe that it crushed the back seat where the child was sitting almost all the way to the front seat. Another view of these two vehicles, you can see that the bumper on the SUV on the left is almost barely crushed. Matter of fact, accident reconstructionists who looked at these two vehicles determined that there was only a little over, I think, an inch or a couple inches of crush to the bumper of the SUV. Now there was over 4 feet of crush to the car that was struck. And so you got disproportionate damage. And what we also learned is that the action reconstruction was able to reveal to us that there was 5 times greater strength in the front end of the SUV compared to the back end of the sedan. And so that was the start of the case. You can see here the complete loss of survival space, the violation of DeHaven's principles, that you should maintain survival space. The survival space can't collapse. This young man, and this is what's called static crush versus dynamic crush. What you're seeing here is less crush than what would have actually happened in the crash. And I may show you a video later to demonstrate that principle. But this was tremendous crush for this vehicle. All car manufacturers have basically the same warning on their visors, and they tell you, which is almost intuitive to us now. You would ask anybody on this webinar or anybody up and down the street, where is the safest place to put children? And they would all tell you the back seat. And so here's the issue. This whole litigation is many times about children. It is often children who sit in the back seat of cars. This is a crash test and really gets down to the heart of the problem, in my opinion. This is a Honda Civic vehicle. It's just the only crash test that the federal government requires into the back of vehicles. And it's only tested to protect the fuel system. So you can have a complete collapse of the back seat of a car, even in this test. But as long as the vehicle doesn't leak fuel, it's okay to sell the vehicle. And so let's watch this and you can kind of get a feel for what the test looks like. And you can see there is no occupant dummy in the back seat. That's the crash goes forward. You could even see the back seat of the car moving forward some. This is not tremendous crush, but this test is run at 50 miles per hour. And so it's our position that 50-mile-an-hour impact is foreseeable. Remember, DeHaven said that vehicles should withstand the forces of foreseeable collisions. Well, the federal government says that rear impact crashes can happen at 50 miles per hour. This is a crash test that we ran. We ran it for litigation purposes. We hired experts who went out and ran crash tests, and we crashed it at 50 miles per hour. Ford Motor Company is a car company that I know crashes vehicles at 50 miles per hour. Other car companies crash their vehicles, car-to-car crashes at 50 miles per hour. This is a video I edited, so bear with me on the quality. So you can see the impact, the crush at 50 miles per hour. And I'm sorry for the quality of that, but it goes through into the back seat, pushing the back seat forward in this crash test. And the sedan that struck in the front is crushed further. You can see now an interior picture and see how the back seat is crushed forward. This is an actual test that many car companies run. And so it's our position that a car should be designed to withstand these type crashes, 50 miles per hour, which is the same speed the federal government runs their crashes at. And what we found in this crash test is that rear seat was crushed forward all the way to the front seat, that the forces on that back seat were over 100 Gs. That is unsurvivable. A human being cannot withstand those type forces. So it was more than just a loss of occupant space. That the accelerations, because once you absorb energy by it crushing, which is lower than 100 Gs, but once the bumper of the striking vehicle gets to your back seat and it's pushing your back seat forward, now you're being accelerated at the same speed as the vehicle that struck you. There's no more absorbing it. The person sitting in that seat is now the absorbing object. They are absorbing the energy. And so someone sitting in that seat would be absorbing 100 Gs worth of energy, which is deadly. Another view from behind. So we looked at what would you do to stop this from happening? How could you prevent this type collapse? We built a vehicle. We used techniques that we say other car manufacturers use in different components of their vehicle, things like filling it with foam. And as you can imagine, if you had a Coke can and you filled it with foam, it's harder to crush than if it were hollow. We used high strength steel. We used reinforcements and different character things that car companies use. And what we determined is that a car company for $58 could, in fact, make their cars more rigid and stronger. This is a crash test that we ran on a sedan. And you can see here that and let me stop this. This is in this crash test, this is the reinforced that we built. This is the alternative design, the $58 alternative design. And you can kind of compare. This is also run at 50 miles per hour, the federal government speed. And you can kind of compare the damage between this vehicle and the one I showed you earlier, the damage where the seat was collapsed all the way forward. Watch this damage. So while you do still have a very severe crash there, 50 miles an hour, you also don't get into the back seat. Here's a view of the damage after the fact. You can see that the occupant compartment is still present. DeHaven's principles are at work. It absorbed energy in the back of the car, but it stopped it before it got to the occupant. And that's what it's designed to do, should be designed to do. And our position is that a car company could do that and should do that. This is an interior view. You can compare this to the interior view of the car manufacturer design versus the one we built. And while the back seat does move forward, look, the occupant compartment space is maintained. There is no crush, and in fact, there's a great deal of survival space left, even in the same 50 mile per hour crash. And we didn't just stop there running a car-to-car test, because we wanted some objective measurements of the forces it would take to crush the back end of the vehicle. And so on the left, you can see the crush of the vehicle as it was designed by the car manufacturer. On the right, you can see the crush of our alternative design under the exact same forces. The one on the left, as you can see, crushed far greater than the one on the right that we built. And we in no way inhibited the utility of the car, didn't change it. We didn't take up the trunk space so you couldn't put groceries back there, golf clubs. It didn't substantially add to the weight of the vehicle in any meaningful way. So what we did, we said, was reasonable. We could do that to cars and not impair their utility. One of the big issues in these cases that I think you face is the fact that car companies, if you're a plaintiff and you're litigating these cases, car companies can't really defend the fact that their car didn't crush. I mean, in some cases they would say what the plaintiff said didn't happen. Well, what I'm saying is the car crushed. Well, you can look at the car and tell, well, it absolutely crushed. It crushed all the way. There is no defense of the fact that it didn't crush. And so what I believe you face many times in these cases is a defense on causation. Why? That's what they have left to argue. They argue that the crash was more severe than is reasonable, and then they argue causation. And what they will say, I think, many times, is that the impact to the of the rear of the vehicle is the initial impact is what caused the injury. The initial impact, in my case, that young 5-year-old boy broke his neck by going, and I'll turn sideways. You can see me. He broke his neck by going backwards. That's what they say happened. And they say that because they want to be able to argue that he was hurt before the car crushed. If he's hurt before the car crushed, then the car crushing doesn't matter. He was already dead before that. And thus the fact that our car crushed is irrelevant. And so they argue that, in my case, they argued that he got his head up over the car seat and it went backwards. We were able to show, or hope to be able to show, that he could not have gotten that high. The bottom red line that you see is where the injury occurred. The top red line is where his neck would have had to have gotten, and he was restrained, and we were saying that he couldn't do that. Couldn't get that high. It's a big difference. 4 inches is a lot. But we didn't stop there. We went and ran a crash test, our own crash test. This is called a sled test. So we ran yet another test in this case. We ran the sled test, where we ran a rear impact of a child in a car seat at the same exact speed that the defense had said caused the injury. And so watch this, and you can kind of see how benign that really was. There was really no opportunity for the child to get hurt going backwards. And the head never gets to that position, partly because not only does the car seat restrain the child, but the vehicle itself has a headrest that also provides restraint for the head when it's going backwards. And so we were able to show that that rear impact before the car crushed could not have been the injury causing mechanism, was our argument. What we did try to show, though, is that the getting pushed forward was the cause of the injury. And so we did a timing analysis. We looked at the crush of the vehicle. So in the initial crushing of the vehicle, in that soft zone when the car's supposed to be crushing, but getting harder and harder, that 0 to 30 milliseconds, first milliseconds of the crash, the child would have been going backwards. And we demonstrate here that the child would have been, as we just showed you in the video, would have been restrained by the seat and the car seat behind him. Then, as the crush begins to get to the occupant compartment, the occupant compartment begins to crush. The child now is going to be moving forward. And we demonstrate here what is going on in that 30 to 70 milliseconds as the seat moves forward. Then later in the crash, much later in the crash, the 70 to 110 milliseconds, now the car seat is being thrown forward at 100 G's, 30 miles an hour. The child is rushed forward. And instead of getting injured by going backwards, the child is injured going forward. The young child's neck broke going forward. And so that was where we were at on that issue. And that's how we plan on showing that. This is another case a third case that we recently handled involving a young man, Dominic Perez. I don't know that I've ever had a better client. We were able to resolve this case for, I want to say $45 million. It's an enormous settlement. And I couldn't be happier to have done that, because this child is the most amazing kid. He is a ventilator, or was a ventilator dependent quadriplegic. Look at his eyes. You know why he's got eyes like that? Because he's smiling behind that mask, and he never took the smile off his face. He had every reason to be sad. He had every reason. I never was around him, never had any interaction with him when he wasn't smiling. I never saw a picture of him when he wasn't smiling. He was just an amazing young man, and I was honored to represent him. I will add this, that the settlement that we were able to obtain for him in that case resulted in him being able to have a surgery that got him off the ventilator. And that was a huge change of his life. It allowed him to, it allowed his parents to sleep at night because they don't have to worry about the ventilator, the battery going out or the power going out. And it allows him to be able to talk normally. It may be something small to us, but for him, it was a huge improvement in his life. And not only that, he was able to change their whole house, get the vehicles they need, ingress and egress out of the home that they need. I was honored to represent him, and I hope you could tell. This case really dealt with vehicle-to-vehicle compatibility, which is kind of a little bit of a different issue, but it is still a rear crashworthiness case. So in this case, same issue. I've got a struck vehicle that is substantially more damaged than the striking vehicle, and so again, my interest is piqued, but I'll look at that Jeep and I'm like, it doesn't even look like it's in a crash at all. I mean, for the first time in these cases, I'm thinking, there's got to be something wrong here. This is, while I've seen disproportionate damage in the past, I've never seen this much disproportionate damage. And so I began to ask myself, what's going on here? And it wasn't long before I figured out what was going on. This was the really shocking thing. This is the Delta V, the EDR on the crash. This is the black box download of the vehicle. And what you can see by looking at this is that this was an 18.5 mile per hour crash. So go back to the screen. That vehicle that got struck there, that crushed all the way to the front seat, that paralyzed that awesome young man, was in an 18 mile an hour crash. If you were to ask anybody, do you believe that this kind of damage, what's the speed of if you just looked at the Honda and you said, what was the speed that vehicle was struck? And somebody said 18.5 miles an hour, nobody would believe it, but yet it was. And so why did that happen? It's because of a problem called incompatibility. Now, vehicles, there was legislation that was proposed to aftermarket manufacturers of lift kits, and many states adopted it, some didn't, different forms of it, but the manufacturers of lift kits were involved in putting together this model statute or model legislation, and the whole purpose of it was to prevent incompatibility. And so what you want in a crash is the strongest structures of a vehicle in a rear impact especially are the bumpers, and you've got to engage the bumper. If you miss the bumper, everything above the bumper is basically sheet metal. And so what we have here is, if you put the vehicle that's striking it, the Jeep, too high, it's going to go over the bumper, and now you're only engaging sheet metal. So you've got documents from the industry that say things like modifications that result in an excessive increase in the ride height of raised vehicles may create a mismatch in the geometric alignment of energy absorbing structures. Those energy absorbing structures are the bumpers. So if you raise the car up too high, you're going to miss the bumper, and it's common sense. After that legislation was proposed, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration then kind of gets together. They bring all the car companies to the table. They bring all the players to the table, and they come up with this thing called the vehicle-to-vehicle compatibility agreement. And what that agreement says is that all cars are going to be made with bumpers between 16 and 20 inches off the ground. It doesn't matter if you drive a big truck or a little car. All bumpers have to be between 16 and 20 inches. You can go out in your car after this webinar, take a ruler, and what you'll find is that your bumper is 16 to 20 inches off the ground. That is, unless you have a lift kit. If you drive a big, say, F-350, the big Ford, or a big, General Motors truck or SUV, well, the initial bumper may be above 16 to 20 inches. But what those vehicles do to meet the compatibility agreement is they have what's called a SEA device. So that's a secondary energy absorbing device under the bumper that acts as the bumper, and it will grab if you run into a little sedan and your bumper goes over the sedan's bumper, there's a SEA device under that to catch the bumper. Okay. And so you can go out your car, and if you drive a big SUV, you'll say, well, Chris, my bumper was higher than 16 to 20 inches. So I'll look under the bumper, and you'll see an SEA device under that catches the bumpers of the people you hit. And that's to keep what you saw with that Jeep and that Honda from happening. Here, the lift kit that was placed on this vehicle completely defeated the purpose of the compatibility agreement. The bottom of the SEA device was at 22 inches. The SEA device, even if you have another device under the bumper, it cannot be higher than the bumper of the car that it's going to strike. Here, the bumper of the Jeep and the SEA device to the Jeep was so high that it went right over the energy absorbing structures of the Honda and crushed it. And so we brought our claims against the Jeep, against the lift kits. We went and looked at Jeep's own documents, and the case was not against Jeep, but we used their documents, and their own documents basically tell you can read this here, that once you add a lift kit, the vehicle is not even safe for on road. It is an off-road vehicle only. And it says, do not drive your vehicle on public roads and things like that. I mean, this is how dangerous these lift kits can be. That the car manufacturers understand that once you put them on your vehicle, you've created a weapon that's not even safe to be on the road. Georgia has addressed it by statute. The state of Georgia has a statute that says that you can't move your bumper or you can't raise your suspension system on your vehicle more than 2 inches higher than what the manufacturer of that car recommends. And what you can tell in simple searches on the internet is that many lift kits are 4 inches or higher, and violates the statute that's in place. And so you got that argument too in these cases. And so those are some of the issues that we face in these cases. I am very honored to have learned a lot about these, because I feel it gave me the opportunity to help some very deserving families. I can never replace what they lost, but we can always try to make it better and hold those responsible that I believe were responsible for what happened. And so anyway, now I've kind of taken you through the presentation. I don't know if there's any questions, but if so, I'd be happy to answer them.
Absolutely. And Chris, I want to thank you on behalf of all of our viewers for a really wonderful presentation. I'm always amazed by the work that my partners do. So much of what you talked about today, I got to be honest, it's kind of news to me, and I just find it fascinating. So if you don't mind, I've got a couple of follow-up questions I'd love to pitch to you, if that's okay.
Sure.
And taking these in reverse order, you were just speaking with us about these SEA devices, and for people that own, let's say, a GMC Sierra AT4, or some of the comparable Chevy Silverado variations that kind of come with these factory installed 1 to 2 inch lifts. I mean, how do they work around that? I mean, how does that get out of the factory?
Yeah, so that's what I drive. I mean, I drive a GMC truck, and what you'll see is that and you probably have never noticed it if you weren't looking for it. Your bumper is very noticeable on my vehicle. the GMC. There's a big silver, huge bumper that everybody in the world can see, big steel bumper on the front of the vehicle. But what did you do if you kind of get on your hands and knees and you look? There's going to be a black steel bar under that. That black steel bar is going to be there to catch the vehicle in front. If I can, I keep, as doing car cases, I always have cars at my ready because it helps me understand it. But imagine if you've got a little bit higher car that strikes the car in front of it, right? Well, it's going to go over that bumper. Well, if I had a structure underneath this one, it would still catch the bumper of the car that it struck. That's what these SEA devices do. And I call OEMs, is original equipment manufacturers. That's Ford, General Motors, Honda, Toyota, all the names of the cars we drive. All of them, when they sell a car, even with the lift kits factory installed, will comply with the compatibility agreement because they said they would, and they do. And it's only really when you add an aftermarket lift kit to a vehicle that you begin to get into trouble in getting above that compatibility agreement.
Okay. Well, along those same lines, how about brush guards? You know, I see a lot of trucks and a lot of SUVs that have these really massive brush guards on the front. Some have a practical purpose, I know, and some just look cool. But I mean, how does that change the characteristics of a rear crash when you're struck by a vehicle with that? Are there any state or federal rules or regulations that apply to those type kits?
No, and there should be. I mean, and frankly, that's probably an area of litigation that ought to be developed. I think that what you see is those brush guards, and as you correctly noted, most of these people driving around with lift kits and they alter their vehicle with these. And for those of you who don't know what a brush guard, it isn't a very aggressive structure on the front of a SUV, a Jeep, a truck that would be designed to drive through the woods. And if you hit a small tree or something, knock it down. It would be something much stronger than a bumper and wouldn't dent in if you hit a small tree. And so you would put this brush guard on the front of your Jeep or truck. If you were a farmer or a forestry guy and you had a truck that was to drive out in the woods and you needed that, I can understand the utility of a device like that. The problem, as you recognized, is that 90% or higher of people that have these type of devices never go off-roading. They're to look cool. They want to look tough and cool, and they drive these things. These structures are so strong on the front of vehicles that they would blast right through another car. And so, you know, they don't absorb any energy at all. They're not designed to. They're designed to withstand the forces of impact. So, that I would be really concerned, and frankly, never had a case involving a brush guard, but would be if I saw a case where that would have piqued my interest instantly.
Well, let me ask you this question, because I have people ask me this same question a lot. You know, when a viewer is contacted by a rear crash injury victim or a family member of a victim, I mean, what are some of the steps that they need to take immediately to inspect or preserve the crash scene and the crash vehicle? Because I know there's some pretty strict rules with that sort of thing, and what do they need to do?
Well, if you'll notice on this presentation, there were 6 vehicles that I had in my possession. I had 6 vehicles that I maintained at a storage facility that our firm utilizes. I purchased those vehicles, I moved them to the facility, and they stayed there throughout the pendency of the litigation. And so because of that, it's a product liability case. The product is your evidence. I mean, there's an old rule in product liability case that says no car, no case, no product, no case. And so it's your evidence. And so I need them both. You've got to preserve the evidence. And I don't know how many times I've spoken to a lawyer. It sounds a lot like they got a really good case. And then I'm like, you know, before I finish the conversation, they're like, well, the car was crushed last year. And my heart just sinks. And I'm like, I'm sorry, I can't help you. There's nothing I can do. Without the car, it is my evidence. So we have to get those preserved. That's step one.
Is there a particular place that a viewer can, reach out to for help in securing a potential client's crashed vehicle, or would you just simply recommend they call the experts, they call you guys?
Well,
as soon as possible.
Yeah, our firm, we've got a team of investigators that work at our firm. We've got 8 investigators. All of them are ex-law enforcement guys. The 2 people we have in Georgia are former skirt accident reconstructionists. They are the last 2 guys who trained the other accident reconstructionists for the state of Georgia's state troopers. They are great. They are excellent at tracking down vehicles. And many times when a lawyer comes to us and says, I think the car's gone, they can still find it. I think of a time last year, we had a vehicle that was apparently gone. It had been at a auction at Copart, which is a storage facility here in Georgia, that stores cars for insurance companies after crashes. And that car had been taken to Savannah when it was about to be loaded onto a cruise ship, or a ship to be taken to Saudi Arabia. Why were they taking a crashed car to Saudi Arabia? It was because they can take a car with a salvage title or no title and fix it and drive it over there. Nobody cares about titles. And so they take these crashed cars and sell them overseas and drive them. And so, which you can never do here. Nobody ever get title on it. Well, we were able to get it off of the ship. I told our investigator, you to go to the ship and get it off the ship, and send a check with him to buy it off the boat. And so we've done some aggressive things at times to try to keep cars if we can.
Let me ask you this question. This came in from one of our viewers, Teresa, and she asked, is there any pending federal legislation to require auto manufacturers to improve the rear end crashworthiness of vehicles?
There is not, and I would if I had a mission in life, that would be what it was. Outside of my faith and my family, I would say that would be one of the things that I'm passionate about. We have, in the last 20 years, we've seen the front ends of cars. They went from having one set of tests the federal government required, and then IIHS started doing offset frontal tests, and then they started doing small offset frontal tests, and that's a whole different topic. But now all cars are made in the front to withstand a number of crashes. And like I said earlier, in the rear, you only got to protect the fuel tank. You can crush the car all the way to the front seat, but as long as that fuel tank doesn't crush, the car can be sold. And a lot of times, cars are made to crush. They're made to direct the energy up and over the fuel tank, because the fuel tank is basically under the seat. Well, when you direct the energy up and over the front seat, you're directing it right into the people in the back seat. And that's while you've protected the fuel tank, you did it at the expense of lives in the back seat. And I've got a theory on why. And I would ask people watching this webinar, how many of you had somebody in the back seat of your car today? Most of us didn't. Most of us drove to work, came logged on this webinar without ever having anybody in the back seat. A few of us took our kids to daycare or school, but after we dropped them off, then you were alone again. So statistically speaking, you were going to be alone with nobody in the back seat if you're in a rear crash. So they can build that car with the chances that even if it crushes, nobody will be back there. And that's my theory. But
well, Chris, I can't thank you enough for really a wonderful presentation. And for those of you who may have missed our earlier announcements, by the end of this week, you're going to receive an email with a certificate of attendance and an updated presentation and a link to today's program. You can email your completed evaluation form to webinars@beasleyallen.com. Again, for those Alabama and Georgia attorneys who are participating by phone today, please email us your name, your phone number, and your state bar ID number. Send that to webinars@beasleyallen.com to ensure you receive full CLE credit. Also, we'll remind you again, be sure to check out the events page of our website, beasleyallen.com/events, because we're going to be adding more webinars throughout the year. Hey, thanks to all of you for joining us today. Thank you, Chris, and thanks for supporting our Beasley Allen webinar series. Have a great day.